Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us to learn more about this important topic. I'm Maren Bzdek. I'm the Historic Preservation Manager for the City of Fort Collins, and joining me as a co-presenter tonight is Jim Bertolini, who also works for the city as a preservation planner. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to share some stories and also some perspectives on how to approach aspects of this history that we've either already uncovered or are expecting to be working on in the next couple of years. And so we'll be talking a little bit about our grant funded project that we'll be kicking off, as well as some of the research work that we've been doing, as well as work by local history partners in the community that's already underway. And we have presented on this topic to all sorts of folks with varying levels of interest in history, including a lot of different audiences inside the city. So I just want to say right off the bat, it's great to have the chance to dig into this with an audience that we already know is really appreciative of history and knows the broad value of understanding local history. And of course, thanks to organizations like Historic Larimer County and many of you folks that are here tonight and others who aren't here, we know a lot about our local history. We have a lot of good records. And we've had a lot of dedicated effort over the years, and we just really want to acknowledge that collective effort that has gone on and see this as a way to add to that effort in a way that complements what we already know about our community. And of course, anybody who's involved in history knows that collecting and telling those stories is never done, and we can never have enough effort in that regard. And so much of our history has been lost. And so a part of this also is an attempt to uncover some of the more hidden aspects of the places that we're already familiar with for other reasons. And then in particular, our work at the City of Fort Collins, Jim and I are both historians who work in the public sector, and we have a particular charge to consider how our work in the city's Historic Preservation Division intersects with the city organization's broader equity and inclusion goals. And so that's another reason why this project has come about. As we at the City of Fort Collins seek to create a stronger sense of belonging for the diverse collection of people who live here today, it's important that we add some of these lesser known but equally important stories to what we already know about our city and region. And so I think you'll find there's some surprises and new opportunities to learn by using this lens. And I hope that you'll feel as inspired as we have in our just early explorations into this topic by the end of tonight's presentation, and we'll invite you to get involved. And I just want to say a couple of things about some of the fundamental principles and how this work, how this topic of civil rights relates in particular to our work in historic preservation. And I'm sure most of you here, if not all of you, already have a strong understanding of the role of historic preservation as the process that we use to identify important places in our community that have meaning or value to us today. And it's also a set of processes that we use to maintain those places for the community's greater benefit. So when we talk about the power of place in this work, we're not just talking about how place is a powerful tool that can convey the stories that are meaningful to us. We're also talking about the fact that there's an implicit power structure that influences which stories, buildings, and sites get preserved or told, and that end up on the list of our so-called important buildings. So as we're charged with understanding how places that we traditionally recognize fit within this system of historic preservation that we've been using for decades, we are again using this lens of equity to think about how our program is serving the community. And so all of this work is emerging from where we can see some gaps in both what we know as well as the way that we're serving the community. The work of historic preservation is really only as equitable as we decide to make it as a community, and it's really something that all of us need to participate in together in order for it to be successful. And we know, if we our people who work with history that we're always applying new insights about the past as we move forward in time. And that allows us to highlight these new places and to tell stories in ways that we might not have told them, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and certainly beyond. So, here's an example on this slide, just to kick us off. You've got two juxtaposing examples of widely recognizable historic buildings to those of you who are familiar with Fort Collins history. Both of these places are important, and both in their own way reflect probably the most predominant theme in our community history, which is agriculture, but from very different social positions, right? So the Johnson Barn in the lower right, a functional building, a building that's a local landmark that represents a prosperous local farm and farming family that once spread over many acres east of town. And then we have the Holy Family Church, the Catholic church that represents the heart of our earliest Hispanic community of sugar factory and beef field workers who came here as a result of the agricultural production of northern Colorado. And this is where they worshiped and educated their children in segregation from the white community. And it's still, of course, an important center for the community today. So with those general ideas in mind, I'll turn it over to Jim and to delve into a little bit more information to kick us off.
So as Maren mentioned, what we choose to preserve and how we kind of weigh the values of what we decide to preserve. It reflects values for us and our values as people, as well as a community. And that's an important conversation, because we know, and I know with Historic Larimer County, we kind of all know this as folks who engage in preservation, is that these places have power. They have the power to instruct. I'm sure, that's a big motivation for preserving historic places, is the lessons we can learn from that, or the perspectives we can garner from them. But they also have the power to help us reflect, and have the power to help us belong. When people can see themselves in the history of their community, that's a much more powerful way to get people engaged and participating in ways that extend beyond just, studying history and preserving history. And that power is why preservation is not just about preserving, the lifestyles of the rich and famous, buildings as art. Those would be the highest style of architectural examples, or the places of community founders. That's another common trope of early preservation, is places like the Avery House, the Shealy Drive Landmark District, where a lot of major business leaders of the 1950s and 60s had their homes. Other places like that. There's always going to be room for those, but that's not the full story. It's not just about cute buildings that have minimal alterations. Preservation is most powerful when it's preserving community fabric, heritage, and community identity. And that means preserving places like workers' housing, enclaves of racial and ethnic groups that reflect a full story of the community, stories that may not be apparent from just looking at a place. And again, that's something I think we're familiar with as local folks who study local history, is that we know sometimes that story is not obvious from the street. Sometimes you got to dig a little bit into the archives. But we're talking about that full story, though. What does it look like? For one, it includes Black American experiences, whether it's a modest home like the McDaniels family home on Cherry Street. That's where Hattie McDaniels and her family lived for a few years here in Fort Collins before she achieved her fame as a songwriter, singer, and actress. And she was the first Black American to win an Academy Award for her role in Gone with the Wind. It also includes Hispanic experiences like the Romeros, who lived at 425 10th Street. That's that picture on the upper right there. There were New Mexicans from Santa Fe. They moved to Fort Collins in 1920 to work at Great Western Sugar, like a lot of Hispanic families in the 1910s and 20s. And John Romero became a community leader and advocate. He provided translating services for a lot of Spanish-only households in the neighborhood, and notary services for those same folks to make sure they had access to legal representation and public services, and ended up supporting a lot of child welfare projects in Fort Collins as well. But speaking more generally, this can also include sites of conscience, places where the story may be traumatizing or shameful, or is part of a struggle to belong and achieve civil rights. And the role of preservation in that case is to ensure that those sites remain so that they can continue to instruct us. The example there in the bottom left would be the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. It's both the site of a brutal attack by the Alabama State Police against a peaceful march to Montgomery in 1965, followed by a second march 2 days later led by Dr. Martin Luther King. It might also be the Stonewall Inn, which is there in the bottom right. This is a site of fighting with the police in 1969. It's considered the single pivotal moment in the American gay rights movement. It drew attention to the need for equal rights there. So preservation, while we're materialistic, it's often about the stuff. We talk about buildings and windows and entries and things like that. But preservation is also about the stories that those things help us tell. So ultimately, preservation is about people. So being able to tackle the complex stories of the people of our community starts with awareness. And again, I think that's something we all probably are familiar with. We've got to know the stories before we can kind of call attention to them and help preserve the physical reflections of that. Knowing that those stories are attached to places in our community allows us to better target our efforts to preserve the important stories. While that work's always going to be ongoing, I wanted to take a quick note to start with what we do know, what the research is that we've done so far. On our website, we're going to talk about this towards the end, is where to access some of our completed research. Some of that's just on web pages, some of that's in the formal histories that we've published over the last couple decades. Those include histories on the sugar beet industry, the Germans from Russia, Hispanic history. And then we're working on adding to that list, and that's part of what this is intended to do. And just as an example of how important it is to be aware of these stories and just how intangible they might be, photo on the bottom right there is the Geller Center. And some of you might be familiar with that history. This recently went through a development review process that really highlighted the importance of knowing the story before making decisions about what to do with the place. In this case, the Geller Center started out as the Westminster House and later became the United Campus Ministry. It was eventually taken over by the Presbyterian Church as kind of a church student services center off campus in the 1950s. 1962 really transformed under the leadership of Robert Geller into what would become known as the Geller Center. It was an interfaith social justice center, included Native American students at CSU, many of whom came from out of state and didn't really have a place to come together. The organization there, the ministry there, engaged Tres Colonias and attempted to improve living conditions among Hispanic families in the neighborhood. They helped establish a lot of other organizations. It was kind of an incubator for a lot of the social justice organizations that we still have today. They're promoting community services and helping people in need. And so those include the Fort Collins Food Bank, Black Student Service Organization, Alternative Spring Break Program, Drug and Alcohol Center, I believe is now Turning Point, if I'm not mistaken, and one of the first hospice care programs in at Poudre Valley Hospital. So none of this is something that's obvious from the street. This looks like kind of an early 20th century house with a little kind of office addition on the front. But that kind of humble looking property has a really important story to tell when we're talking about social advocacy here in Fort Collins. And so it's a good example of how these stories are often hidden right underneath our noses, and we have to spend time doing the research to tell those stories. So with that, I'm going to hand things back to Maren. We're going to go through a couple of these themes that the project we're talking about, the Civil Rights Grant Project, a couple of the themes we spent some time on, and a little bit about what we already know about those themes.
So the first theme that we're going to explore is women's suffrage, which came about because of the recent 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which was in August of 2020. And that gave us a great opportunity to discuss in particular, how local women contributed to the fight for women's right to vote, both in Colorado and across the nation. And of course, there were celebrations and recognition and of historic sites and stories throughout 2020 in celebration of that centennial. And of course, suffrage was a national movement, but it included people organizing across the country in local places as women gradually gained the right to vote state by state. And we know that the suffrage movement, when you look at it from a civil rights perspective, wasn't just about suffrage. It was galvanized and inspired by the broad ideals of liberty that were espoused in the abolition movement. And so it really, in many ways, was tied to it from the beginning. There was much common ground between suffragists that used a lot of the same tools that abolitionists had proven to be effective in raising the interest of others in the cause of abolition, such as boycotts and public speaking and mass petitions, all of which emerged in that era. But when we look at it through our understanding of social history today, we have to think about who suffrage was for. And of course, that depends on where you were and who you asked. Not all suffragists, of course, supported universal suffrage for women of all races, for example. Although the movement, again, relied on abolitionism, relied on the participation of Black women like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman as leaders, was also supported by people of various classes in the labor movement. So when we look at a theme like suffrage, as with all of the themes that we're exploring as part of this study, it gives us an opportunity to look at, again, that connection between the local and the national in both directions, and also to think about how our local participants in those stories were conscious of the work that they were doing and how they were influenced by local conditions. So some of those people became very prominent at the state or national level, such as Theodosia Ammons from the college, who became active in the national movement as a result of some of the experiences she gathered here in Fort Collins. What's really interesting about suffrage is that, of course, Western states were leaders in the movement. Wyoming, of course, being the first state to extend suffrage to women in 1869, and then followed by Colorado shortly thereafter. And, in 1893, when that happened, we were also the first to enfranchise women by popular vote in a referendum. What else was going on in 1893? We were going through an economic panic, which of course hit Colorado hard. Our population was expanding very rapidly. It had increased tenfold between 1870 and 1890. And so who was participating in and present for that rapid expansion of the population of the state? People of all classes, races, and ethnicities, including a lot of African-American women, Chinese women, women from the labor movements, Black women such as Elizabeth Piper Ensley, shown in the middle, who was in Denver, and very prominent famous women such as Molly Brown, shown at left. So again, Western states being at the forefront of the movement, why was that? And what can we learn not just about how Fort Collins fits into that regional history? If you look at women's suffrage even globally, you can see that what happened in Western states with early suffrage happened in other places that were remote hinterlands in their various countries where white colonies were forming with limited populations of white settlers. So in general, in those locations, beyond the major population centers of those countries, white men were more likely to extend the vote to white women to further coalesce the power of the settler communities in those new locations. Of course, those rights for women were tempered by limitations such as whether women owned property or were literate or were widowed. And of course, tempered by this idea of white womanhood in the 19th century, which generally was limited to the domestic sphere, away from the sullying influences of business and public life. But in the West, it was different. It was an idea that carried from the East to the West in the United States, but was weakened as a practical matter because the settlements were new and women had, on average, white women in particular, greater freedoms to participate in their communities. And so as that protected domestic sphere did prevail, despite the achievements of women like Elizabeth Ante Stone, shown in the upper left, who was, of course, a businesswoman, a community leader in her own right, very important, and eventually became the first woman to cast a vote in our community. But, at that time, as the community was transitioning from essentially an army camp into a settlement, the prohibition movement was very important as a part of that transition. It was a central topic in many Western towns, of course, as they evolved from those kind of rougher early years into communities that were considered safe for families to settle and grow. And so suffrage was intrinsically tied to this idea of the importance of prohibition as a women's issue. Fort Collins, if you know your Fort Collins history, we did have a period of early prohibition from 1873, I think, to 1875, a couple of years. And then there was a local petition that repealed that, but it was still a central concern for those who had advocated for it. And they continued to advocate for it until we passed prohibition again. And during that time, prohibition and suffrage were pretty much yoked together. And the movement leaders emerged in large part from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who were sort of playing that dual role. So let's look then at the central portion of this slide. You may recognize that house at 137 Matthews, known as the McIntyre House. It was one of our fine early homes, constructed, in fact, by Culpitz and Boyd, who also built the Miller Block. They built the Welch Block, Old Main, RIP, on the college campus, and I believe also the Remington School. And so we typically know this house for its association with Josiah McIntyre, but Lucy Richards McIntyre, Josiah's wife, who's pictured here below the home, they were an upper middle class family, and for her, temperance and suffrage were two important intertwined causes in her life, and really the primary activity of her adult life. So while Josiah was known as a prominent lawyer and judge, and in fact, I think he was the first blind person in the United States to earn a law degree, which is very interesting. But the home has a much longer association with Lucy McIntyre and her work in the suffrage movement. Josiah only lived there for 11 years before he died. Lucy lived in this home for 60 years. In fact, she lived to age 96 and died there in 1940. So when the McIntyres moved to Fort Collins, the first experiment in prohibition at Fort Collins had just failed. But again, as I said earlier, the fight was not over, and many women saw it as that primary motive to gain the right to vote. So after statewide suffrage was achieved in 1893, Lucy became active in the Prohibition Party of Larimer County. And she's the type of civil rights leader that I would say is more readily known by historians in the past and thought of as a leader in this regard. She was a founder and president of the local chapter of the WCTU. She hosted their meetings here in her front parlor, which is that room behind that canted bay window that's on the left side of the house there. And of course, in a Victorian home, which was large enough to delineate inside public and private spaces, that front parlor was an important kind of interstitial space between a public and private area. It was a natural location for women to gather within the domestic sphere and yet engage in discussions and activities that were related to public life. So Lucy, had a lot of free time to organize. We know from the census that she had a domestic servant living in the house with her, which freed up a lot of time for her to write articles and give speeches and host these meetings. What we also know about Lucy is that her writings indicate that she was not a proponent of universal suffrage, meaning the right for all adults to vote without restriction. In fact, her public statements on this matter clearly indicate her idea that educated white women were more deserving of participation in the political process than uneducated people, who she referred to in one piece of writing as the, quote, ignorant and debauched class. So from her point of view, she was advocating for suffrage based on essentially playing on class differences and ethnical and racial biases that were, of course, common at the time. And she was far from alone in that position. Suffrage in Colorado, an earlier 1877 petition for suffrage actually failed because Colorado lawmakers were worried about the consequences of giving all of those African American and Chinese women who had moved into the state during that population boom I referenced earlier, giving them the right to vote was a concern. So one of the things that we're able to do as we look at these histories today and form a more honest account of them is that we can acknowledge some of the limitations of those movements, even as they were important in creating progress. And so here's another interesting thing to ponder in our local suffrage history. Look at the image of the woman on the right side of this slide. Her name was Jenny Goodall. She was an African-American woman who lived in Fort Collins for a time in the 19-teens before moving on to be one of the founding property owners in the Deerfield colony, which was the African-American agricultural colony east of Greeley. And she was a member of, believe it or not, the local WCTU chapter. And she hosted many of those other members, perhaps even Lucy McIntyre herself, in her much more modest residence, which is shown here in the lower right at 131 Mack Street. And you can see the ad above it calling for the next meeting, which I believe it was in 1914, noting that everybody was invited and they could get on the streetcar and ride down Mountain Avenue and get off at Mack Street and walk over to her house for the meeting. So you just have to wonder what sort of conversations, maybe even debates, occurred between a woman like Jenny Goodall and a woman like Lucy McIntyre. And even just pondering that possibility is a different way to think about this chapter in our history. And of course, by the time they were having that WCTU meeting in Jenny's house, African American were technically allowed to vote in Colorado. But of course, they were living in the Jim Crow era where the rights of Black citizens were under constant threat from de facto segregation. Native women, Asian women couldn't vote at all, were not considered citizens. And so the white middle class movement led by leaders like Lucy McIntyre continued to play on that need to counteract the votes of uneducated people in order to maintain that base of support and power, and included vocal discrimination against the white immigrants who were moving to Colorado in large number, including the Germans from Russia and Italian immigrants, as well as, of course, the Hispanic community. So I think that's a really good way for us to really think about when we look back on the achievements of suffrage. And then, of course, you know, that period from 1893 leading to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, we can think of these as milestones, but we can also think of them as an imperfect progression that paved the way for future successes, of course, but that national entanglement over voting rights continues today in its imperfect way, still reflecting, you know, that same pattern of history. I'll turn it over to you now, Jim.
So moving on to one of our other topics that we intend to talk about is that story of Asian American history here in Fort Collins, which, as Maren already alluded to, this is a story that is pretty much as old as the state. And that has a lot to do with the history of Asian immigration into the United States starting in the mid-1800s. Chinese immigration in particular started in the late 1840s, and that relates to the California Gold Rush, and not only providing labor being recruited into mining camps, railroad teams, and then just providing, you know, support for the service industry around those things. By 1851, 25,000 Chinese residents had immigrated to California. They were pushed by instability and food shortages in southern China. They were pulled by recruitment opportunities for mine and railroad work. So most of these were younger men, spoke little to no English, which is part of why the railroad companies like the Central Pacific were recruiting them, since they wanted cheap labor and didn't really care about translation on the job site. And they became the main source of labor for the Central Pacific Railroad, which is the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad built over the 1860s. So you see that as that work's completed, up to and after 1869, Chinese residents who came here tended to either continue working for the railroads. So you often see small Chinatowns in just about every Western town that had a railroad connection. You see them entering the service industry, running shops and laundries throughout the Western United States. And Fort Collins is no different. Especially after the railroads were complete, though, there's a significant amount of white resentment to continued Chinese presence. There's anti-Chinese riots throughout the West. Most notably in Colorado would be the Hop Alley riot in Denver in 1880. But there's widespread violence throughout the Western United States against Chinese immigrants. Scholars suggest that for a voluntary immigrant group, for a group that was not a refugee group, came here because they were recruited to do work, it's hard to find another group that suffered worse than the Chinese. It's culminated in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act by Congress in 1882. It's the first major restriction on free immigration to the United States. It made Chinese immigrants permanent aliens. It excluded them from US citizenship, restrictions that would not be relaxed until after World War II. And in fact would be further restricted in the 1924 Immigration Act, which excluded the Chinese from immigration altogether and extended that to other Asian countries as well, including Japan. And so when we're talking about Colorado in particular, that early story, the first few decades, is mostly about Chinese immigrants and them trying to make their way here amid violent opposition to their presence. By the time we hit the 1890s, early 1900s, we see a lot more Japanese immigration to the United States. And a lot of those folks are working in agriculture. They're working on ditch crews, they're working in farming. And for more successful folks, they're starting to buy and operate their own farms. And when we come specifically to Fort Collins, this is admittedly a story that we don't know a lot about. So we have a section on our website dedicated to this. We've worked a little bit with the Asian and Pacific American Student Center, or Cultural Center, excuse me, at CSU to help craft what we do have for this. But the main story that we have so far centers on, fairly typical of the national context of a few Chinese-owned shops that actually stuck it out after 1882, after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Probably the most notable one of those is the Hong Sing Laundry. There was a laundry operated here on North College Avenue. That'd be 154 North College, where the Perennial Gardener is today. And there was a laundry, a Chinese laundry, operated in that location since 1882, actually. Different owners over that time and different buildings. It started out as a frame building and then transitioned in the early 1900s over to the brick building that's there now. That's one of the most notable examples. But then we also have a lot of stories in the newspapers, especially once we hit the 1900s, noting large crews of Japanese ditch quarry and farm workers. And that, in particular, when we're talking about the Japanese, we see them come up. They're advocating in the labor field. Some of those ditch crews and farm workers went on strike for either better wages or better conditions. And in fact, in the quarrying, part of why we know about this is the Ingleside Quarry disaster. So that was a limestone quarry operated by Great Western Sugar. And there was an explosion there in 1908. And of the 7 men who were killed, 2 of those were Japanese workers. And the other 5 were Mexican. I think 4 were Mexican-American and 1 was Italian. And that just kind of shows you who was doing the work that sustained some of these booms in Fort Collins economic history that drove the growth as a city, who was actually doing the work to make that growth possible. And often without a lot of ability to buy in and participate in the community. So after we get past World War II, we have some other examples. But again, admittedly, this is a less well-studied part of Fort Collins history that we intend to push a little bit farther on. So we have folks like CSU student Chet Maeda, that would have been the Colorado Agricultural College at the time, who was a vet student and Aggie football player, later served in World War II after he graduated. He's one example of a Japanese American student that sort of pushed boundaries. And we see that happening a lot in Fort Collins across a number of racial boundaries over the 1940s in particular. But we have a lot to learn in this particular area, especially when we get into that post-war era where we want to understand more about the role of CSU in attracting Asian American students from across the country, as well as immigrants from around the globe, from all sorts of parts of Asia, not just East Asia like China and Japan, but also West Asia, where we're talking about Iran, Iraq, India, and other areas that were, many of them coming to CSU in particular for either veterinary medicine or civil engineering programs. And what we also don't have a good grasp on, especially for this project, and we're hoping this project will help fill that in, is grasp on social activism in the broader Asian American community here in Fort Collins, talking about civil rights history and how that was affected, because we know the Asian American Cultural Center at CSU is a later addition to those student services. And so we'd like to learn a little bit more about that story. So with that, I'm going to hand things back to Maren.
Thank you, Jim. And I think I didn't really underscore as much as I meant to at the beginning, although I think it's probably pretty obvious by now that we're skimming pretty rapidly over some of these themes with the intention really just to give you a sense of just how broad and rich the opportunities are to bring some of these stories together. And so I do want to just say, the idea is to just give you a sense of it and to be clear that there is a whole lot that we're leaving out, even just with the basic information that we know and that we've been able to gather. And here's another good example. I'm just going to very quickly chat about Black history in Colorado, and then more specifically in Fort Collins. And there is, we could have a whole week full of presentations on this topic alone. But when you think about when Black Americans began to come to Colorado and where they were generally coming from, and then how our Fort Collins history relates to that, many Black Americans, many of whom were freed slaves, moved out of the South after the Civil War, especially out of the Mississippi River Valley to Kansas and other Western states. And then some of those earliest migrants, who were referred to as exodusters, ended up moving further west into Colorado. And so many of our most prominent earliest Black residents would have come from some of those Kansas families that established in Topeka and Kansas City, or were the children of those families that moved there in the late 19th century. And of course, Denver became a well-known, well-documented regional hub for the Black community, starting, in the 19th century, and then of course strengthening quite a bit in the 20th century in the Five Points and Curtis Park area. And because those communities, or that community at large, was sizable enough, it was able to support a full array of economic and professional activity, where you could have people who were educated professionals as well as blue-collar workers who were able to essentially use their training in service to the Black community because it was large enough to support them. So a couple of examples from the Denver area here: Dr. Joseph Westbrook, who moved to Denver in 1907 and was an officer on Denver's Interracial Commission. He was on the YMCA board of directors. He was a member of the NAACP, and he was a delegate to the RNC, and really considered one of the most important Black activists of the early 20th century in Denver. And then there's Dr. Clarence Holmes, another example, who was a Howard University graduate in dentistry. He was actually born in Denver and then went back east to go to Howard. He established the Denver Interracial Committee in 1916, helped establish the local NAACP. And so for African Americans living in Denver, that was really, of course, the center of activity, just as it is for many local history themes. And so for communities that were smaller along the Front Range and in southern Wyoming, Denver was the place where they could create ties, have opportunities, and then, of course, this is still the Jim Crow era, also have some opportunities in some of the smaller communities. But it was difficult to sustain those populations, is really what it comes down to. Fort Collins is a really good example of, you see a faltering attempt with a very small number of individuals and families to build a flourishing Black community in the early part of the 20th century. Would you go to the next slide, please, Jim? So this is true for Boulder. This is also true for Greeley, Cheyenne, and Deerfield, which was founded as a Black community. It was difficult outside of Denver to sustain those communities. And we're really only just starting to build a meaningful base of knowledge, therefore, about those early residents in those communities. And just for years, our understanding's been really limited. So we've got Charlie Clay. Many of you probably know Charlie Clay in the image on the upper left. He was an early Fort Collins pioneer, the first documented Black resident in the community. He raised a large family here. He lived at that home on Maple Street that's just below his photo there. And incidentally, that home was raised by the city in the 1970s to accommodate the new city complex, along with several other important residences associated with the early Black neighborhood. So we know Charlie Clay. Perhaps you're not aware, though, that Jenny Goodall, who I showed you on the slide where we were talking about the WCTU and suffrage, she, along with Charlie Clay, who was a minister, and some other early residents, tried to start a Black church at that site, the Clay family home, in an attempt to provide that important central locus for the Black community to grow here, which of course was the church, a very important institution in the Black community. That church, which had a very short lifespan at that site, was seized by the local sheriff. And I'm not exactly sure of the whole story. We only have limited information from the newspaper and a very abbreviated record there. But we do know that subsequent attempts to start another church over the next couple of decades were not successful. One of the people who contributed to that effort was Charlie Birdwhistle, who is shown in the photo with his wife, as well as some guests who are unknown to us at this time, in their home at 1005 West Oak Street, which is shown below them in a contemporary photo today. So Charlie and Mamie Birdwhistle lived in that home from the 20s to the 1940s. And Charlie was a minister. He also worked as a waiter and a janitor around town, the Northern Hotel, the Elks Club, and a couple of other locations. But this home is a very important place in our Black history in Fort Collins because it was a very well-known place for people to stay who were coming through Fort Collins and who were African American, and they were staying overnight. So if you were a musician, a theater performer, a student, a traveler, and you were coming through Fort Collins, you could stay in the Birdwhistle home. In many respects, it functioned as a de facto Green Book site, although it was never formally listed in the Green Book. So that's the Birdwhistles, another important family that there's a lot of information about that hasn't been compiled, and the story really hasn't been prominently told. The full richness of the Birdwhistles' family life and their contributions to the community are only starting to emerge. And of course, their life was limited by discrimination in Fort Collins in that era. As you likely know, the Klan was powerful in our state in the 1920s in particular. That included Fort Collins. They held meetings in Old Town buildings. They marched through the town in uniform in 1922 in the college-sponsored events. They burned a cross in City Park in 1925. They were visible, they were known, and for the Birdwhistles and other Black residents at that time, it certainly would have impacted the climate in which they were living their lives and carrying out their livelihoods. And as the years wore on, honestly, in the early half of the 20th century, first half of the 20th century. It didn't get much easier, although the community did grow a little bit during that time. Here we begin to see some important civil rights milestones in the 1930s and 40s. In 1939, for example, we've learned that Maddie Lyle, who is shown in the photo in the upper left, crouching down with her husband in the middle with his hands on the shoulders of their daughter, Joyce. That's them outside of their house, which you can also see in the middle photo. That house is currently standing today at 310 North Meldrum. And then the building on the bottom was at that time in 1939, the site of the State Theater. It's now the Whiskey State building today. In 1939, for reasons that we don't fully understand, we know that Maddie Lyle sued the State Theater, the owner of the State Theater, for discrimination, and she won, and she was awarded a settlement. We suspect, based on the information we've been able to uncover from the legal record, that she wanted to be able to exercise her right to sit wherever she wanted in the theater, which she had gone to that day with her daughter Joyce, shown in the photo there, and a couple of friends, and the court agreed that the owner had denied her this right, which was violating Colorado state law at that time. And of course, this was a time when white trade only signs were common throughout Old Town. And what wasn't common is for people to challenge what was essentially the common operating procedures in Fort Collins businesses, for many business owners anyway. So that's a really important story, and one that we've really only recently been able to highlight by doing some of this initial research that we've been doing. And of course, we're very thankful that the home is still there and that it hasn't been lost, because the house next to it, which was also occupied by the Lyle family as well as some other early Black residents, has been demolished in order to accommodate the new mixed-use building on that corner. Another important nearby location in that same area, on that just around the corner, is at 308 Cherry Street, which was the former home of Virgil Thomas, who was the first Black graduate of Fort Collins High School in 1940. And we are proud to say our first Fort Collins landmark that was just recently landmarked and recognizes Black history in our city. Because despite communist understanding, the Hattie McDaniel House is not a Fort Collins landmark. So despite Maddie Lyle and Virgil Thomas's achievements in the late 1930s, early 1940s, we know that an atmosphere of discrimination continued in Fort Collins for non-white residents, certainly beyond, immediately after World War II and beyond. Some of our most prominent early post-war developments from the late 1940s, such as Slade Acres and Circle Drive, included racial covenants that prohibited anyone who is not white to purchase property there. So what you're seeing there is from the Slade Acres, shows you the racial restriction highlighted in red there, and that specifically limits that development to Caucasian residents only, unless they were servants living with white families. So Virgil Thomas, for example, who had left Fort Collins after graduating from Fort Collins High School, gone on to study in college, was drafted into the Army and served in World War II. If he had come back to Fort Collins after the war, he would not have been allowed to buy a house in Slade Acres or on Circle Drive, and that was common across America and also common here in Fort Collins. Nor would the Lyle family, who were educated teachers, but while they lived in Fort Collins, and they did move away during World War II, by the way, they were limited to janitorial employment opportunities. And so one of the reasons why they left to go to Seattle, we've learned, is to seek greater opportunities. And so this is an example of the difference between being educated and living in Fort Collins and being educated and living in a larger city like Denver or Seattle, where you could practice among your own community without discrimination. So really important to apply that local lens to our history and to put it into the context of larger municipalities. I'll turn it over to you now, Jim.
Obviously, when we're tackling a story like this, when we're talking about civil rights, we have to talk about our largest minority group here in Fort Collins, which is our Hispanic community. And the Hispanic experience in what became the United States predates the existence of the US as a country. And the Spanish were the first European settlers to permanently colonize the Americas. And the fusion of Spanish and Portuguese culture with an already vibrant culture of indigenous people here created a new kind of tapestry of cultures and identities and peoples in what's now the Southwest US. And in fact, a significant chunk of Colorado used to be part of Mexico. As the Spanish Empire pressed north along the Rio Grande River, we have exploration and settlements, especially in southern Colorado, in the San Luis Valley in particular. By the time we get to the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848, those settlements in Colorado were permanent. And those people became American citizens. It's one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is that the vast majority of formerly Mexican citizens that lived in what became the Southwest US as a result of that treaty just became American citizens. And in fact, that culture became endemic to the culture of the American West. A lot of the imagery and culture of American cowboys, which when you think about how endemic cowboy, cattle raising and cowboy culture is throughout the West, a lot of that culture comes from the traditions of the vaqueros, of the Mexican cattle ranchers and the workers. And when we get to the Civil War, New Mexicans enlisted several regiments during the Civil War to help press back the Texas invasion in 1862. So the arc of Colorado history is similar to other regions of the country, where Mexican Americans increasingly found themselves relegated to service work, agricultural work, and with few protections. And a lot of that is as a result of shifting from a Spanish model of communal property ownership over to the privatized and individual property ownership of Anglo-Americans. And so as a result, they were facing loss of wealth building opportunities, few protections, and then discrimination at the hands of whites in the communities where they lived and worked. And that precipitated a massive labor movement in the 20th century, in particular, the mid-20th century, to address poor worker protections, poor pay, poor living conditions. And so when we get into the mid-20th century, you're seeing people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. They organized the United Farm Workers Union, which became kind of a central part of the American Chicano movement, which was really the Hispanic civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. So we see a lot of these arcs play out here in Fort Collins when we're talking about our local stories. So specific to the context, this one's admittedly a little bit harder to sort of pack into a civil rights story, just because Hispanic history in Fort Collins is a huge part of our story. And when we're talking about the people who sort of built Fort Collins, a lot of that work, whether we're talking quarrying, farming, working in the sugar factory, a lot of that work has been done by Hispanic residents since the late 1800s. And this is an area where, there's a lot of groups that are trying to call attention to this history and raise this up. Probably most notably is the Museo de las Tres Colonias. And we're specifically talking about Hispanic history through the lens of civil rights, because segregation and discrimination against Hispanic residents in Fort Collins was so prevalent. Many of the key locations of Hispanic history in the city are tightly connected to this specific civil rights story and civil rights advocacy. So that's going to include social institutions like the Holy Family Catholic Church that's there on the upper left. This developed in its first location actually as a frame church at the northwest corner of Whitcomb and Cherry Street, and then moved to its current location as the brick building in 1929 when that was constructed. Might also include sites like the Rockwood School. I don't have a picture of that up. That was basically a school built over in North Lemaine near Andersonville. And that was demolished in the 1970s and 80s, which was basically a school for students who lived over there who were predominantly Hispanic by the 1920s. It includes the Fuyana Elementary School, which is now the Fuyana Learning Center, and that's shown in the bottom right. That was built in 1975 and is a really just getting that elementary school constructed is one of the central equity and civil rights stories of our Hispanic history. In this case, challenging overt discrimination by the school board, which was seeking to basically reappropriate funds from a community funding effort away from the Hispanic community that had driven for that funding, and pull that funding back in to make sure that there was an elementary school in the Hispanic neighborhood of Holy Family after 1975. But all these sites, their stories extend well past, and I should mention, sorry, on the upper right there, that's the 1957 City Hall and police station. It was that until the current City Hall was built in the 1970s. And that's been a site of protest as well, City Hall in particular, where Hispanic advocates protested police harassment, brutality against Latinx residents, and also lack of access to public services, including running water from the 1970s up through the 1990s. So there's a mixture of stories here, and a lot of these sites, their stories are beyond civil rights. They have cultural and social history wrapped up in them as well. But what we'll be looking at in this project is the history of advocacy. So people like Father Juan Fuyana and others that were specifically trying to advocate for access to public services, access to the ballot box, those sorts of things, and fighting against discrimination in housing and employment in Fort Collins. And just a few of those people we talk about, I'm sure some of these names might be familiar, especially to this group. I would hope everyone knows who Lee Martinez is on the right side of that picture. And so as with all aspects of Fort Collins history, these leaders in Hispanic civil rights, they organized from home. That's one of the reasons when we're talking about landmarking places and protecting places for future benefit, residences end up being in the mix there because a lot of the work being done for community organizing and advocacy was done from home. And a lot of those residences remain. They're good reminders of both the success of these individuals and of their longstanding involvement in Fort Collins, not just the Hispanic community, but at large. So on the left side, when we're talking about Tres Colonias, you have families like George and Inez Romero. They became neighborhood organizers, translators, legal advocates to ensure the neighbors had access to goods and services and work. On the north end of Old Town, on Willow Street, you have families like the Lobatos. So there you have in the middle, Jovito Vallecillo Lobato, who was the first Mexican-American graduate of Fort Collins High School, and she was the first Mexican-American graduate of the Colorado Agricultural College, which is now CSU. And so she lived in 402 Pine Street for a lot of her life with her family. But she was also one of the first teachers for the ad hoc elementary school that was held in the parish hall at Holy Family Catholic Church. And some of the other business owners, like the Godinezes that founded El Burrito, just down the street from Pine Street. Part of what motivated them to get those businesses started was that there were so many white trade only signs, either saying white trade only or no Mexicans or Indians. And so a lot of the businesses created were in some ways their own civil rights story. And many of them were on the north end of downtown there because they were effectively trying to provide those goods and services that white shop owners and white restaurant owners were not interested in providing to Hispanic residents. You also have, when we get into the Holy Family neighborhood on the west side of Fort Collins, that's where or the west side of College Avenue, sorry. That's where you get families like the Martinez family, which again, I hope everyone at least has a basic understanding of Lee Martinez and his importance to Fort Collins history. Another community advocate, he's considered one of the most important Hispanic community members in the city's history. He's the namesake of Lee Martinez Park, just north of his family's mid-20th century home. And so when you're talking about mid-20th century community organizing and advocacy, Lee Martinez is right at the center of that. And so these are just a handful, especially considering how big our Hispanic community has been in the past. This is just a small sliver of some of those key people. And we know we're going to have a long list of names of people that we need to talk about and probably need to talk more about in more context, about their influence on how Fort Collins has developed. And when we're talking about civil rights in particular, the activism when we get into the mid 20th century, a lot of that's driven by students, CSU students in particular. They ended up organizing two different organizations, MACE, which was the Mexican American Committee for Equality, and then UMass, which actually still exists around the Front Range, and that's the United Mexican American Students. And they often organized in an intersectional way. And we know that's going to be an aspect of this project, is talking about how these different identities overlap. And so when we're talking about Chicano advocacy in the 1960s and 70s, this starts with a pressure on university administration to do better on recruitment and retention of students and of staff members at the university, but it very quickly extends into the life of students off campus, which includes, for Hispanic and Black students, it includes housing discrimination. It includes frequently employment discrimination if they were holding down a job in addition to going to school. And so a lot of this intersects with that. And since, especially for Hispanic students, since a lot of their extended families worked in agriculture, we see a lot of coordination with the local chapter of the United Farm Workers Union. Again, that's the one founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. They had a local chapter and they organized quite a bit around labor rights. One of those examples in the 1970s, Safeway was in labor disputes with some of their farm workers. The student organization and the UFW chapter here in Larimer County organized boycotts of Safeway, trying to get people to call attention to the just horrible working conditions of a lot of the agricultural workers who were putting food and produce into that grocery store. So that work, especially the student work, eventually resulted in the formation of El Centro, which is the student service office at CSU for students who identify as Hispanic. And so this is, arguably this is, an ongoing story, but this is another aspect that we're going to have to talk about. And with that, I'll hand things back to Maren.
Thank you. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes here talking about LGBTQ history and our efforts to contribute to really what is an international effort to capture the history of the LGBTQ community. And, it's challenging to work in this area, particularly as preservationists, because so many of the milestones are very recent history. There are visibility issues related to a faint historic record that reflects that long trajectory of discrimination and violence. And because so many of the contributors to these stories are living today and participated in that recent history, they don't always have the same feelings about what to share about that earlier history, how much to share, or with whom. And so these are some of the important issues of public history that are being navigated by the LGBTQ community as these projects move forward. And they're very important considerations for us, whether we're members of that community or allies. The National Park Service has published a nationwide LGBTQ history theme study, which came out in 2016. That was actually supported in part by a donation from Colorado's own Gill Foundation, which was founded by a prominent LGBTQ community member in Colorado, Tim Gill. That was the very first LGBTQ history project worldwide, although England, I think, came up with a similar project very shortly thereafter. And this was, again, a response to lack of representation and either ongoing invisibility or even active erasure of LGBTQ history, as well as the particular characteristics of identity as it relates to sexual orientation and gender. So knowledge of these conditions presents a certain level of urgency to the work that we also recognize here in Fort Collins. So that study that recognizes sites that are of national importance to LGBTQ history also gives us a framework at the local level for thinking about how that history unfolded here again, in its own particular way, and also how it was different, both just here in Colorado and more specifically regionally in Northern Colorado. So just a couple of quick highlights here. We've already talked about Stonewall, which you can also see here. It's now a National Historic Landmark as a result of this national effort to recognize the places that are of national significance, and the uprising that occurred there in 1969, which, by the way, was led by people of color and transgender people, not just strictly an intersectional group of folks. Also shown on this slide is the Henry Gerber House in Chicago, which is also a National Historic Landmark since 2015. Henry Gerber is often referred to as the grandfather of the American gay movement in the United States. So despite the fact that this is an 1885 Queen Anne that was built for a different purpose, it was converted to a boarding house in the 20th century and became a meeting place for the first gay rights organization known as the Society for Human Rights in the mid-1920s. So a very important, nationally significant place for gay history. The very first gay periodical in the United States was published from this location. He was a German immigrant and he was arrested, and his society was dissolved abruptly and all of his work was confiscated while he was working in this place. And he was, by the way, also fired from his job at the post office. So a very interesting site. We have our own versions of these places in our state as well as in our local community. So at the statewide level, History Colorado is providing a lot of leadership in this space. They've recently hired a curator for what is a new LGBTQ project. They're building a collection. They're building a museum exhibit that will travel and an oral history collection. The Colorado Historical Foundation has been working on a project supported by funds from the State Historical Fund to begin identifying places around the state that are associated with the LGBTQ history. And then here locally, I want to call attention to one of our local history partners, Professor Tom Dunn at CSU. His project, the Queer Memory Project, which is shown in the lower right there. That's just a quick snap from his website. He is one of the Montfort professors at CSU, which comes with funding, and he used that funding to establish this Queer Memory Project, which is going to collect for Northern Colorado oral histories, documents, and artifacts associated with our local queer history. So in Fort Collins, really rich territory to explore here, primarily another example of how we're often reinterpreting historic places that have aspects of their histories that are not commonly known by the public at large, but usually commonly known by the gay community, because much of that history was closeted while it was occurring, although not all of it. So LGBTQ sites include places also associated with, and this is true of all civil rights, ephemeral events such as marches and rallies and celebrations, dances. So for example, the Bellevue Grange, the first site that we know of in this area for gay community dances, which were held there in the late 1970s when that space could be rented out by community members for various purposes. We learned about that through some members of our local community who shared that information with us. We've also highlighted our own Lincoln Center because of the dances that were moved from the Bellevue Grange to the Lincoln Center in the early 1980s. That move itself was important because it created a safer place for those gatherings to occur. And there were roles that were played by city employees, city police officers in order to facilitate the safe gathering of people for early dances in the early 1980s. And if you're familiar with the Rainbow Chorus, a very important community organization that of course performed at the Lincoln Center regularly over the years. We've got Old Town Square and the Freedom to Marry rally in 2004 featured in the upper right, and Library Park, where the first Pride in the Park event was held also in 2004. So again, a reinterpretation of places that we already recognize for other reasons, some of which are under city stewardship. And so as folks who are responsible for thinking about these places and helping the city care for them, these are important stories that We also share within the city organization community so that people can understand how our organization has contributed both positively and negatively to civil rights history in Fort Collins. Turn it over to you, Jim, for the next slide.
So in wrapping up here, one of the things, of course, when we do a project like this, the intent is that we're going to learn something new. We're going to fill the gaps in what we don't know. And so what we don't know is vast. We don't know. We depend on what people decided to record. It's a common problem with history. I know we've got some professional historians in the audience here, so you know this quite well. And of course, what people decided to record is limited by their bias in that time. So we know in Fort Collins, a lot of our records are skewed to represent the white, middle, and upper class aspects of Fort Collins history. That's what newspapers at the time period tended to focus on, especially when we're talking about the 19th century and into the 20th century. It's what the museums, once we had a museum, it's what they tended to preserve in their local collections. And it's the stories that people tended to tell. It's the founders syndrome of, the Avery family, or, pick a street name and the person named, the person that street is named after. Those are the people we tend to talk about. People without economic or political power, they simply weren't written about. And that's had to do with resources to preserve and write their own history. It had to do with often having their history written from the perspective of others, especially white middle class folks who were journalists and authors. And so many of the stories we care about are oral traditions, and they're passed on in other ways than the traditional sort of written sources that we work with. So we know we need to do more research in a lot of other areas. Civil rights is a big one, and that's why we started this project. We went after the grant funding for this project. And so that's going to include all the stories we talked about already, all those aspects of civil rights advocacy going back to women's suffrage the whole way through the 20th century. But we know there's other stories that have to be part of that as well. And so we're really trying to broaden our methodology here and broaden our perspective on local history. And specific to this project, so this is a civil rights context. The product that this project will complete is a historic context. So that's really just a report about this aspect of local history. So it's a report on intersectional civil rights in Fort Collins. What's really, and it's funded through, I do want to note that it's funded through the State Historical Fund. So we applied for a grant and got our award recently for that. So we're going to be moving ahead here in 2022 to get this project done. But what's really unique about this is the approach. And this kind of signals a shift that the broader history profession is making, which is shifting gears from how we would traditionally do this, where we just hire a historian and kind of sit in a room, visit a bunch of archives and write stuff down, and really shifting this to as much of a community-led event as we can. So we formed a group of community ambassadors from various identities that represent various identities from around Fort Collins that have an interest in history and telling the story of their community. And we intend that group to grow as we move through the project. But the intent is for this to be not so much about the story of civil rights, but as a collection and kind of a facilitated platform for a lot of different stories and a lot of different perspectives about the civil rights history in Fort Collins from a lot of different people. So expect it to be a little bit sort of healthily chaotic, and we're hoping that that'll be a productive way to do this. So Maren, I'll hand this back to you to close this out.
Okay, well, I think we've really covered a lot of just the general kind of foundational principles that we've captured here on this slide, why we're doing this work, why we think it's important, the ways in which it's challenging us in our traditional methodologies, and then the opportunities that we have for collaboration with new community members who have not previously felt either that they have a place at the table for this particular conversation, or just have not really seen the value. And we've already found that just from a bridge building perspective, we have been able to begin relationship building and dialogue with community groups across the board with all of the themes that we've discussed here tonight in ways that we previously didn't have those relationships in terms of our particular division. So that's really important for us if we're going to be serious about diverse engagement. And Historic Larimer County has an important role to play there. And Jim, if you'll go to the next slide, I'll just kind of close out with a couple of notes. So first of all, I see Historic Larimer County and all of the other entities that those of you who are here tonight who are involved with in various ways as opportunities to amplify this work. And we're all conveners, capturers of information, we share information in various ways. All of us have different things that we can contribute to this. And I really want everyone to feel, we want everyone to feel very welcome to share resources and ideas with us and to challenge this, because part of what we're trying to do is not just produce an effective report and get people involved, but also to think about what it means then for future projects, which we expect will emerge from this baseline context study that we're identifying. For example, if you look at our website and if you go to the drop-down menus on our main page, which is at fcgov.com/historic preservation, you'll see that there's a historic places tab, and you can drop down and click on local history, and that gives you the deeper dive into some of the topics that we've discussed here tonight, as well as a lot of the context and theme studies that have been developed since the 1980s through the preservation program in Fort Collins. And of course, there are so many other resources available to us through our local archives, through the university, and all of those wonderful partners we have locally. But what we want to invite you to do is to think about, by looking at the information that we've provided, exploring some of the virtual tours that we've posted under each of those chapters, so that you can walk around the community, look at those places on the ground, and start to think differently about your understanding of your sense of place here and really the complexity of our local history. And I think if we can all do that together, one of the things that we hope for is the opportunity to open up some of those narratives, those stories that we all tell in ways that challenge all of us to tell more meaningful and rich and difficult stories. If you have those stories, if you have those resources, and you'd like to contribute to the State Historical Fund project, please feel free to reach out to us at preservation@fcgov.com. We'd be very happy to kind of pull you in as a resource to that project and to make sure that you have an opportunity to participate. And otherwise, stay in touch with us. If you're interested in future presentations, or if you'd like for us to come speak to another group, please let us know. So thanks, everybody. That wraps up the formal part of the presentation.